Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir.
তোমার আওয়াজ কেটে যাচ্ছে, বিপাশা শোনা যাচ্ছে না কিচ্ছু।
Vipashadi, if you could switch off your video, then you could actually have a little bit more bandwidth.
I can't see her. There is no video on.
Kaushik, am I audible?
লিটল বিট আপনার ব্যান্ডউইথ অনেক লো দেখাচ্ছে, ইন্টারনেট আজকে স্লো দেখাচ্ছে, এখান থেকে শো করছে। আপনি ভিডিওটা দরকার হলে অফ করে দিন দিদি, ভিডিওটা অফ করে আমি অডিওটা অন্তত বলুন।
এখন পরিষ্কার? Am I audible?
একদম দিদি, হ্যাঁ ঠিক।
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a rather auspicious day because we have completed 1 year of our dialogue. It's been a long journey. This is going to be the 11th lecture that is going to be delivered by Dr. Atig Ghosh. I first of all begin by welcoming you all to this lecture today. I must record my heartfelt thanks to our respected Upacharya because this was his idea and this has been greatly beneficial because we have come to know a lot about each other's research work. This was something that was never done before. So it is a very good effort and it's a very good idea and we are trying to put that idea into practice with the help and cooperation of all my colleagues. We have been able to travel so far. First of all, may I request our respected Upacharya sir say a few words.
হ্যাঁ বিকাশ, আমি বলছি আমাদের আজকে টপিকটা কি ছিল? Migration, na?
Migration.
Today's topic, yes, migration. Why people move, the techno-spatialities of migration in human history.
প্রথমে জানাই সবাইকে নমস্কার এবং আন্তরিক অভিনন্দন, প্রীতি ও শুভেচ্ছা। আর আমি আমার আন্তরিক ধন্যবাদ জানাই আমার সহকর্মিনী অধ্যাপক বিপাশা রাহাকে, কারণ যে জাহাজ আমরা 1 বছর আগে চালিয়েছিলাম সেই জাহাজের উনি ক্যাপ্টেন ঠিক মতো করে ন্যাভিগেট করে সেই জাহাজ 1 বছরে তার সফর কমপ্লিট করলো। তার জন্য বিপাশাকে জানাই ধন্যবাদ। তবে এটাও জানি যেটা শুধুমাত্র বিপাশার একার প্রচেষ্টা নয়, বিপাশার সাথে সাথে তার যে সহকর্মী এবং সহকর্মীরা আছেন তাদেরকেও আমি জানাই আমার আন্তরিক ধন্যবাদ। আর যারা বক্তৃতা দিচ্ছেন অর্থাৎ যারা তাদের যে গবেষণা আমাদের সঙ্গে ভাগ করে নিচ্ছে তাদেরকেও জানাই আমি আন্তরিক ধন্যবাদ। To be very frank, I am not an expert in this particular field, and to be very frank, that the credit of sustaining the lecture series should not go to me, because I simply broached an idea to my colleagues, and because of their sustained effort, because of their desire to continue with this kind of experiment, it is continuing for more than a year, and I'm sure this is the beginning, and I hope it will continue with the same enthusiasm which my colleagues, my friends, students and teachers have shown so far. Now this is something which is desirable in the sense that teachers or researchers do their own research, but on most occasions we get to know only when it is published. But this kind of discourse through lecture series will help both the researchers and those who are listening to him or her, because on the basis of this kind of dialogue, a researcher will have the knowledge of what to address, how to address, and in what ways the points need to be articulated. And those who are participating, they will also be geared to undertake specific kinds of research in regard to broad disciplinary framework, history, or political science, or social sciences in general. So I'm grateful to all of you that the idea which I broached had its full form in course of time, of course, with the hard work of my colleagues, and I express my gratitude to all of them. Now, I just make two things, because normally whenever I participate in this kind of discussion, whether it is university lecture series, whether it is this kind of lecture series, I don't see many participants. If you think of participants, because nowadays, since it is not physical mode, it is virtual mode, anybody can get in. We have got 15,000 students, and I'm sure of them, half will be social sciences, and half at least would like to know the methodology, how to carry on a research. So I don't see their representation adequate. That's one. And secondly, also I'm sorry to say that our teachers, barring a few, do not seem to be serious in pursuing academic activities. I mean, they're serious in blaming, in defaming, in abusing people. But when it comes to serious academic research, I don't see many of my colleagues, both in university lecture series and also in this case, I can see only 131. We have got teachers about 443. And students, as I said, 15,000, but of these, I hope half of the students belong to social sciences or humanities sections. So this is a matter of very disappointment to me, and I'm sure both the speakers and also the organizers, including Bipasha. Is it the blame? Is it our blame that we have not been able to generate enthusiasm among our students, or is it the general lackadaisical attitude of our students and colleagues? I know some of our colleagues, enjoy much by abusing people, by writing emails with the aim of abusing, with the aim of hurting, with the aim of showing that they are quite good at offering gali galaj. So probably they are expert in this, but in Visva-Bharati, I don't know whether we have got any school teaching this kind of skills, or transmitting this kind of skills to my colleagues or to my students. But those who come forward, to look after the interest of the students, to look after the interest of the academia in general, they are shown to have been experts in these non-academic activities. And I am saying it with evidence, and I'm sure those who are listening to me, they also are aware who are these culprits, who are these miscreants, and who are these individuals who don't have any interest in the academia, but they have interest in everything else. I'm saying this candidly so that it should go to them. I who are the people I'm talking to, because they don't have the guts to come forward. They transmit emails and they transmit all kinds of abusive expressions, abusive letters to my colleagues, and they enjoy by being abusive, as if Visva-Bharati is a specialist in teaching people how to abuse others, even how to hit somebody below the belt. And this is one thing which I'd like to convey to my students, to my friends, to my colleagues in Visva-Bharati. And the second thing, I say it with a lot of pain in me, that somehow or the other, these miscreants of this university, greatest because it was founded by one of the greatest human beings of human history, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. Somehow or the other, our teachers, colleagues, they don't feel ashamed. They don't feel the abuse as a matter of undermining them as colleagues. When my colleagues are abused as dogs, abused as lackeys, abused as minions, our colleagues remain silent, they absorb. I persuade all of them to go to him and charge him on what basis he has the audacity to abuse us, like, by sending the photograph of a dog. Yesterday he said we are in the gutters. I mean, he has every responsibility to clean the gutter. Let him come. So, I also urge my friends, my students, my colleagues to stand, because you have nothing to lose. To stand, at least, get rid of these miscreants, get rid of this, Gande Nala ka Kira. They're all Gande Nala ka Kira. That's why our colleagues, move around Bolpur town with the photographs, Upacharya Dalal. So they are all gutters, they are in the gutters. That's why they probably use these kind of filthy words so happily. So my request, my colleagues, those who are listening to this webinar, because you are young colleagues, you have the future, the Visva-Bharati's future lies on you. You have to protect Visva-Bharati. But if we allow these miscreants, these people of the gutters, to thrive, then ultimately your existence will be at stake. I'll be leaving in 2 years' time. But you will stay here because it is your place where you earn your livelihood. And I keep telling the teachers, we have nothing to lose by being opposed to this kind of people who are from gutters. So this is my, since I got the opportunity, I must, say all this to my colleagues, that please stand up. I'll be with you. If you decide to stand up, if you decide to, teach them the lesson of their life, I'll be the first one to come forward. This is my assurance to you. Because this sort of email exchange by one colleague of this university or few with him as his supporters, those who are coming forward, please stand against them, because they are all people of the gutters. That's why they easily, pronounce these words happily. And they are not only that, they're transmitting this through emails. So my request to all my colleagues, please raise your voice. Do not allow this kind of miscreants to prosper. Ultimately, they will destroy the university. And it is our responsibility to carry forward the tradition which we have inherited from one of the greatest human beings of this globe, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. So these are the kind of prefacing remarks which I wanted to share with you. Now about the topic, as I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert in this particular topic, but given the pandemic, when there is a forced migration, I think this particular topic is very topical, and I compliment my colleague Dr. Atig Ghosh for having agreed to speak on this topic. I wish I could stay here to listen to him, but because of my other administrative preoccupation, probably I will not be able to listen to him fully. But there are
I'll send you the paper. I'll send you the paper.
Yeah. There are colleagues of mine who also worked on migration, and this is an important thing. I know Atig's tutor, this I'm forgetting his name. The Mexican guy, the Indian guy.
Saurabh Dubey. Saurabh Dubey.
Saurabh is also working on worked on migration. So I'm sure Saurabh must have transmitted his ideas to Atig. So Atig's training under Saurabh is, I'm sure, is a kind of expansion of the point of view that he developed in his Cambridge thesis. So I'm really quite interested to look forward to, and at this point of time, especially during this pandemic, when the people living from one place to another for earning livelihood at severe cost, I think this needs to be thoroughly inquired. And I know Saurabh and Marina Carter also, Marina Carter of Cambridge, she also worked on, this migration, indentured labor in Mauritius. And Marina's, I had the opportunity to listen to Marina's speech.
Sir, you have put yourself on mute, sir. Could you please unmute yourself?
No, it has been muted now, I guess.
Yes, okay. Yeah, you're on, back on.
Did you listen to my other,
We heard about Marina Carter, who was also one of my examiners.
Okay, so Marina Carter, so that up to that part you listened to me, right?
Yes.
Including those two point of requests. I guess you must have heard about that. Yes, Atig? Yes. Okay. So it must have been muted or automatically. So I know this is a very kind of interesting topic, and I don't know the focus of Atig's discussion because I didn't have an opportunity to listen to Atig's presentation or had the opportunity to read his text. I'm sure those who are attending today IC 139, they will all be benefited. And what is, I request Bipasha that at least, the most important part of this kind of webinar or this kind of lecture series is the opportunity to exchange views, an opportunity to have a dialogue, both with the students and also the teachers. This is a kind of two-way traffic. And I always believe that in seminar, it is most beneficial not only to the speaker, but also to those who are listening to it. But I always consider myself to be the beneficiaries simply because I hear many comments which allow me to understand the theme or the topic from different perspectives. So I'm sure, Bipasha, you will allow adequate time for question answer. And also, young, especially the young students are here. Please allow the young students to express their comment, to express if they have any query, so that both Atig will also have an occasion to improve his argument, and also those who are listening to Atig will be benefited at the same time. So I always consider the question answer session of any seminar, of any discussion is most interesting. So I'm sure Bipasha, being the navigator of this kind of series, will give enough time for the discussion. And Atig, I'm sure, will encourage this kind of thing, because seminar is not a monologue. Seminar is not man ki barta. Seminar is also a dialogue. And only through dialogue, researcher learns, and those who are listening to the paper, they will also be benefited at the same time. So with this kind of request to Bipasha, I'm just coming to an end with a kind of precautionary note that, we are passing through a severe time of human civilization, thanks to the outbreak of pandemic. Please take care of your health. That's the most important. And now it's not, taking care of oneself is not a very difficult act to do, because as per the ICMR directions, if you use mask, one, second, if you avoid crowded places. And the third is, whenever you get a chance, wash your hands with soap. If you follow these three precautionary measures religiously, I'm sure we'll be free from the disease, one, and we'll be able to defeat the disease in no time. With this, I wish Atig the best of luck, and let me see, I'll stay as long as I can, but as I said, I have another meeting. So once I am needed there, I'll just rush there. I didn't know, I mean, I should have preponed or postponed the meeting, but the meeting was fixed and it's very important. So as Atig has assured me to send the paper, probably I'd like to read that paper in between lines, and if I have got any query, I'll certainly have a dialogue with him. Thank you, Atig. Thank you, Bipasha, and please, all those who are listening to my talk, do not, take it so lightly, because the situation has come when you will have to rise to the occasion. Both pandemic outside Visva-Bharati and pandemic inside Visva-Bharati. By pandemic, I'm using the word pandemic in a metaphorical way. So to contain the pandemic in Visva-Bharati, I think our strength is required, and by that I mean collective strength. So we all will fight for Visva-Bharati, and will fight against those who are trying to pull Visva-Bharati down deliberately for partisan purposes. Thank you very much. Shobai bhalo thakun. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible, Atig?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you,
yes,
sir.
Yes, Bipasha-ji, you're perfectly audible. Yes.
Okay, the whole talk, sir, is being recorded. Kaushik is recording it, and we will put it up also on the Visva-Bharati site later, and I'll send you a copy of the recording also. And secondly, we will allow enough time. Shudev will be anchoring the whole show, so he will be giving the listeners adequate time to express their views. Now, with I request my colleague, Dr. Shoumodip Chithai, to briefly introduce our speaker, and after that, Atig will take on. Shoumodip.
So, thank you, Bipasha Di. Namaskar and good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, today's speaker, Dr. Atig Ghosh, an assistant professor in the Department of History. And as Vice Chancellor has already mentioned, he obtained his doctoral degree from the Centro de Estudio de Asia and Africa, El Colegio de Mexico, for his research on the colonial making of the Mofussil in 19th century Bengal. And Dr. Ghosh's current research focuses on the history and spatial politics of conflict and peacemaking, logistics and infrastructure, populism and political violence, and the questions of post-colonial subject formation in South Asia. His research works have been published in journals as well as in edited book published by Oxford University Press, Springer, Manchester University Press, Routledge, and Palgrave Macmillan. He also co-edited a book titled The State of Being Stateless, an account of South Asia, published by Orient Black Swan. And he's also the recipient of many awards for his brilliant academic records. Dr. Ghosh previously taught also at West Bengal State University, Yadavpur University, Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, University of Calcutta, as guest faculty. And he is also a member of the Mahanirvan Calcutta Research Group, one of the leading think tanks on migration-related research. And today he is going to speak on why people move, the techno-spatialities of migration and human history. So we are all eager to hear you, Atig. It's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoumodip, first of all, for those kind words. You have described me on a canvas that is too big. I'm not that big a person. I'm a small person who tries to make sense of migration and migration-related issues, among other things, as you have mentioned. Let me begin by also thanking the Vice Chancellor. And as he correctly, in my opinion, correctly pointed out, it is very important for us to discuss migration, for us to understand migration, because we think that we live in times when migration has come to dominate political discourses. as we understand them. When we talk of international relations not in the functional sense of international relation studies, but in the sense we mean how people of one country perceive and interact with another country. In that sense, we see the specter of the migrant is haunting academia as well as the halls of power, political power. Normally what happens is that something which is being discussed and debated by the academics, we often find is not something that the people of the world are much bothered with. But here is a subject, one could say, migration, which bridges that gap. For politicians, for lawmakers, policymakers, for economic thinkers, migration is about as important as it is for historians working in dusty, dim archives. So here we find that the university professor and the street corner speaker have been brought onto the same table by a phenomenon called migration, which sometimes is described as new. Sometimes for people who are a little more conscious, they describe it not as new, but something whose magnitude has found a new massivity. It has become massive in a sense that it was not before. Now, as any student of history would tell you, that is patently wrong. Human beings have always been migrating people, and they have always migrated not because they loved to wander, you know, and travel, but they have mostly migrated because they found the conditions in which they were at the moment to be uninhabitable for various reasons, and therefore they were forced to move out of their original location towards a destination that promised greater, better livelihood, greater opportunities, etc. And that is what we are going to discuss here today. I would also like to thank the organizers of Dialogic, of course, among whom I know Bipashadi and Shudebda. They have always been very kind to me, and in this case also they have been particularly kind to me for having chosen me as a young scholar. I'm not that young a scholar anymore at 40, but still they have been gracious enough to consider me young and therefore give me an opportunity to speak in this forum. So I thank them. And finally, I would thank all the people who have come here to listen to me. Normally, this is a long lecture. I have found that on an average, since I've attended all the dialogic lectures till date, I claim that with some degree of pride that I have, because of partially because of Bipashadi, who always reminded us of this lecture. So we did not forget, because of various other engagements one can forget to attend. But Bipashadi always made it a point to remind us that today there is a dialogic lecture, please attend. So I've seen on an average, therefore, people speak for about an hour or a little more. There have been speakers who have spoken for 1.5 hours. There's no such danger from me. I'm very ill, as many of you know, that I have been diagnosed as corona positive. So I'm speaking in a fever interval. My doctor friends have given me medicines. So the fever has subsided, and I'm going to speak in the fever interval before the fever gets me again. So in between, I'm going to try to bore you with whatever research I have done on the subject. And as the organizer of this program has already mentioned, you know the title of this presentation. For a moment, we can forget the subtitle. We may ignored for a moment. We'll get back to the subtitle. The subtitle will be important for us. But for a moment, we may fixate upon the very simple title. Why people move, or why do people move? Now, the simplest questions are the most profound. This statement, attributed to Richard Bach, the American novelist of indifferent ability, may sound like a cliche because it is a cliche. And like all cliches, has a kernel of congealed social wisdom to itself. I have somehow always preferred to phrase the statement slightly differently, as the simplest questions are the most difficult to answer. This is a spin on Richard Bach's statement, the simplest questions are the most profound. I would like to say the simplest questions are the most difficult to answer. And it is indeed such a simple question that we are attempting to answer today. Not to arrive at a totalized conclusion or totalized conclusions, but to open newer possibilities of thinking about it. The question in question is transhistorical and, as you know, titular in this case, that means, why do people move? It is also my hope that the question is wide-ranging enough to engage the interest of a heterogeneous audience drawn from across the university today. Though in the audience, I see mostly my students who have been press-ganged by a senior colleague of mine into attending this lecture, but I also see many other colleagues from various departments. So a general theoretical discussion on migrations without going into very specific case studies or very specific theoretical engagements of specific elements, components of migration might be better, I thought. A general, broad-based discussion, theoretical framework discussion, what we in social science these days call a framework discussion, may be of more, would be more gainful as an exercise, I thought, in a setup which has people from the science, basic sciences, people from, I don't know, from the performing arts, people from social sciences, languages, of course. So I thought I would try at least to reach out. I don't know how successful I will be in my effort. And as a person formally trained in the discipline of history, I've been writing about, as Shomodeep pointed out, and as Professor Chakraborty, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, also pointed out, I've been writing about migration, statelessness, and internally displaced peoples for more than a decade now. But what I've been doing so far were histories. I've been writing histories today, and not attempts at abstract, not attempts to abstract conceptual frameworks from the archival material. Today, I'm going to do exactly that. And therefore, I'm a little, and this is a paper in the making. I've just finished the paper. It is finished. I just have to write a 500 words of conclusion, and then it is finished. This is something I'm writing for the Calcutta Research Group, which Shomodeep correctly mentioned is a forerunning think tank on migration studies. So I've been asked to develop a paper which would serve as a reading material, which would serve as an introduction to people who are attempting to understand migration. So this is the paper. And I just require one last paragraph to add to it, otherwise it is complete. And that is why I was telling the Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, that I can send him the paper. It is done, therefore. And of course, it is being recorded, so it will be circulated. So let me begin by with an anecdote from from the days when I was a student. আমার ছাত্র জীবনের একটা গল্প দিয়ে আরম্ভ করি। I'm mostly speaking in English. I am going to speak in English because many of the people listening to me may not understand Bengali. So I'm going to stick to English. So let me start with an anecdote from my life when I was a student. As a student of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi many years ago, we were taught an extremely popular course by Niladri Bhattacharya. Hence, he is retired a few years back, but for many years, Niladri Bhattacharya taught this course called Historical Methods. It was an extremely popular course. 200 students from across the university took it up. It was sometimes trouble for the history students that there were so many students from outside that we got swamped and we were being graded. Some of them, the other students were not being graded. So we faced that difficulty, and sometimes there were protests that we should not take so many outside students from other departments. but it was that popular that a class of 25 would expand to 200 during this course. There was another splendid course, but it was not this popular. This was a course taught by Radhika Singha. It was, and it went under the course title Movement and Migration. Until much later, I had never thought of these courses conjointly. Not merely because the pedagogical styles of the two instructors, Niladri and Radhika, were completely different, but because it had never occurred to me that the remits of the two courses could share an interface. These two courses, historical method and movement and migration. In the former course, we were bombarded with questions about the ontology and epistemology of facts, the possibility or impossibility of historical representation, narratology, the heterophenomenology of events and experience, and such like. In the latter course, in Movements and Migration, we were taught exactly what the title announced: movement and migration of people in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries over land in South Asia and overseas, and the motor behind their mobility. Dominance in the former course, historical methods, made you the village wiseacre of JNU. Command over the latter made you the hard historian in the wider world you were supposed to become. Now that I'm trying to constellate these courses in the same analytical field, I find the former sliding into the latter to generate what to me are interesting trajectories of investigation. To this, I add the inputs learned during my long training at the Calcutta Research Group. Some of these observations may seem platitudinous to the learned audience, but a rehearsal of what is perhaps the commonsensical may not be entirely meritless, since a large section of the audience today may not have the necessary familiarity with the terms of trade in social science. To get to the main part, contrary to widely held belief, migration and the figure of the migrant, it would be very important. This distinction between migration and the figure of the migrant is going to be a distinction that would be very important for us through our discussion today, through the 45-50 minutes of talking that I would do. This distinction would hold, and we would see in what various ways this distinction between the migration and the figure of this distinction is not a disjunctive distinction. It is not a distinction which separates the two ideas. It's a conjunctive distinction, as we say in today's jargon, which brings the two concepts together while maintaining their autonomous conceptual spaces. So contrary to widely held belief, as I was telling you, migration and the figure of the migrant has been an important dimension of the historian's research for a very long time. Ask any student of history, ask my first years, they would tell you that even books such as the 18th century multi-volume Magna Opera of Edward Gibbon, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, purportedly written as the state and personality-centric account of the central imperial institution in crisis, reveal the constant footprints of migrants in its pages. In the 19th century, the figure of the migrant laborer became a more direct point of engagement for historians, as anybody familiar with the obsessive accounts of colonial gazetteers and records would testify. It is therefore unsurprising to say that migration has been a constant feature of human history. Homo migrans has existed ever since Homo sapiens. Those of you familiar with Yuval Noah Harari's best-selling pop history, Sapiens, would also be familiar that an entire chapter of this book on the history of the human species is dedicated to the flood, indicating through the use of the biblical metaphor of the Great Deluge, how the human species emerging out of Africa rapidly spread over the planet, reaching Australia and the Americas in a matter of just a few millennia. Human beings have always been on the move. Human history is a history of human locomotion. To historians, however, migration generally implies forced migration. This is a term Vice Chancellor Sir has already introduced. And that is the advantage of his speaking first. He would introduce the terms, and therefore we can always go back to them and connect it up with the main speech. I've been speaking in his presence for the second time this time. And in the first occasion also, as in the second occasion, I find this advantage of having him around. Although he cannot stay on today, he perhaps is left, I don't know. But I really appreciate the introductory comments he makes, because then I can quickly connect up. Can you hear me? Vipashadi?
Yes, Atig.
Yes, I can, of course. I can hear you. Atig, I can hear you.
Okay. Na maje mute hoye gelo. It happens na, it continues. Zoom e eta ekta problem dekhechi, auto mutes itself. However, so in historians, therefore, when they are talking of migration, they use about what they mean generally is forced migration for voluntary and or episodic movements of groups and people. Voluntary movement of groups of people or episodic movement of groups and peoples. We historians do not prefer to use the word migration. We prefer to use employ a wide range of other words. The idea of forced migration may therefore seem a bit tautological to conventional historians. For us, a trained historian, if you say the migration and forced migration, then if you say forced migration, the historian would think that why say forced? All migrations are forced. It is a repetition. It's a tautology. We don't need to say forced migration. Every form of migration is forced migration, is what the historians say. Then if you point out voluntary movements, episodic movements, then they'll say, no, there are other terms to describe those movements. They are not migrations. So this use of the less specific term migration, why does the historian do that? Why do historians use this less specific term migration? I feel this use of the less specific term migration has the contemporary advantage of moving away from the traditional nation-based dichotomy of emigration, immigration, and allowing for many possible trajectories, time spans, directions, and destinations. Generally speaking, however, human migration can be defined as crossing the boundary of a political or administrative unit for a certain minimum period. For the UN to qualify as a migrant, you have to have stayed outside your place of origin for 1 year. More specifically, international migration means crossing the frontiers that separate one country from another, whereas internal migration refers to a move from one administrative area, a province, district, or municipality, to another within the same country. However, the historical use has the additional advantage of arguing, as some scholars do these days, that internal and international migrations are part of the same process and should be analyzed together. For historians, as I was telling you, the terms mobility, movement, and even circulation are better suited to encompass a broad range of people, say tourists, business people, the armed forces, etc. They also move from one part to the other of a country, but they're not migrants. For them, historians use the terms mobility, movement, they use the verbs mobilizing, moving, circulating. These are the verbs they would prefer to use. And therefore, we would have the opportunity of discussing more about the labeling strategies. How do we label different movements? As you can see, we are arguing here that the historians would like to use the word migration for any kind of non-voluntary or involuntary movement of people. For the voluntary movements or episodic movements, they have other terms like mobility, movement, and circulation. So historians typically, they do it. As you know, historians, political theorists, sociologists, the whole hog of the social science house, they love labeling. They love categories, and we would have the opportunity to talk about such labeling strategies and what kind of politics it produces in the course of the talk today. History of migration, as such, historicizes the agency and motives of migrants who, within their capabilities, negotiate societal options and constraints in pursuit of life plans. It also looks at both ends of human mobility and at the process of migration. Both ends of human mobility means origin and destination, and it also looks at the process of migration that lies between the origin and the point of origin and the point of destination. Key questions, therefore, that have exercised the discipline may be listed as, this is almost considered to be a crime in professional history to, bullet out questions, bullet out the research questions in most part of the world. In our university, it is still thought to be extremely important that you need to have a set of research questions, as if research questions matter in your research. Anybody who has done research knows that much. But I'm doing it because it is always a convenient strategy. So these questions are, of course, interrelated, but I'm trying to present them before you in a separated, streamlined format, so it becomes easier for those uninitiated with the field to understand the questions, the key questions that have exercised the discipline. And they may be listed as: 1, the reasons and conditions. Let me read that out. The reasons and conditions under which people leave the specific social, legal, and economic setting of their place of departure, coupled with the impact of outmigration on families and societies. 2, the dimensions and patterns of movement through space and time. 3, the migrants' process of acceptance into or exclusion from their host societies, coupled with their impact on the host countries, regions, or localities. Next, the interconnections between the places of departure and arrival, and the power that states have exercised over migrations and the technologies they have used to manage migrants. And finally, migration historians also study the migrants' agency in migrational processes. For example, motivations, networks, impact on structures such as family and state within specific structural constraints. Now, global migrational movements throughout the 20th century cannot be understood without their links to other mass migrations within and across borders or overseas, or to the inter and intra-regional flow of labor involved in processes of urbanization, industrialization, and decolonization. This should not, however, lead to the false notion in the sense of the modernization paradigm of neoconservative thinkers such as Wilbur Zelinsky and others, who argued that migration became a significant phenomenon only in the 19th century as a result of industrialization and urbanization. So what I'm trying to say here is that urbanization, industrialization, decolonization, these are related to these processes, these historical events are related to migration. They have an inseparable entanglement. They are entangled with the processes of migration worldwide, but they are not the only sources. They are not the only sources that produce migration. Or it is not as if before decolonization or urbanization or industrialization, there was no migration. There were migrational processes all through human history, and they were similar in nature, is what we'll be able to say. No unique form of migration has been produced in recent times. We always try to understand our present predicament in terms of uniqueness. Like corona epidemic is a unique epidemic that has that is, you know, that has led to this dismal situation where I have to sit at home and not be at my department to deliver this lecture. If I could, which is a convention, then I would have met Bashadi and we would have had a cup of tea together after a very long time, but that is not possible. So we think this predicament is a unique predicament of our time. That is not true. Historians would patently tell you that these are secular processes. Secular not in the sense of being opposite of communal, secular in the sense of being episodic. So Wilber-Zelinsky and other neocon thinkers would relate migration to processes of urbanization, industrialization, and decolonization, and therefore say migration is a kind of a modernist product. It's a modernization, it's a predicament of modernization, not modernism. Modernism is something different. Modernization, it's a predicament of modernization. But we will not argue that. We would laugh at Wilber-Zelinsky in a bit, because we know that such is not the case. Of course, migration has taken on a character which is slightly different from previous migrational processes after the coming of urbanization, industrialization in the post-industrial sense, urbanization and industrialization, and of course decolonization. But migration fundamentally has remained the same in character. Relevant here, therefore, is the entire spectrum of migration processes within a specific area, including the interactions between all identifiable patterns of migration and the specific socioeconomic, demographic, and political placement. Also to be considered here is the transport infrastructure and communication technologies. These are the specific, within migration studies, this is the specific field on which I work, logistics and infrastructure. So nobody wants to work on, when I was doing my PhD on agrarian history, which was economic history, nobody wanted to work on it because it was technical. Now I work on logistics and infrastructure within migration studies. Nobody wants to work on it because it is technical and therefore boring. But historians have to get used to the boring, you know. Also to be considered here, therefore, is transport infrastructure and communication technologies, as well as the rise of nation states and their heightened concern for regulating human mobility. As the historian, very famous historian of migration, and you know, I've never met him, but we've been very close to meeting each other in conferences, but either I have not been able to attend or he has not been able to attend, so we have not met. But I really, really look up to the kind of research he does. Dirk Hoerder is a German historian of migration. As the historian Dirk Hoerder observed of the 20th century, scholarship has focused on labor, I'm quoting him, scholarship has focused on labor migration systems from 1914, refugee generations in the first half of the 20th century, the impact of decolonization in the second post-war era, and new migration systems emerging since 1960. So we see that scholars have been discussing migration in many avatars, and each time they have fixated upon their form of migration as this unique, unprecedented form of migration. And that form of migration has then been rejected in favor of another unique and unprecedented form of migration as it came along. That is what Dirk Hoerder very clearly tells us in his famous article, What is Migration History? Accordingly, scholars need to distinguish between the various forms and geographies of mobility. So what are the concepts of migration that we are going on and on about? What would it be in a more streamlined, presentable fashion? The 20th century, if we look at it, witnessed a heightened interest among scholars towards migration. By the end of the century, scholars had shifted their focus from the state-centered framework to analyzing human agency. Manush ki kore? That রাষ্ট্রকেন্দ্রিক দৃষ্টিকোণ ছেড়ে দিয়ে মানুষ কিভাবে ভাবে, মানুষ কেন মাইগ্রেট করে সেইটার দিকে ফোকাসটা চলে এসেছে। The state-centric focus framework was given up by the end of the century, 20th century, and scholars had shifted their focus gradually from the state-centered framework to analyzing human agency, emphasizing differences in migration according to gender, race, class, age, and other categories. All of you will admit this. আপনারা প্রত্যেকে admit করছেন, all of you will admit this, that there is migration and the figure of the migrants. The figure of the migrant becomes important here because everybody who is migrating is not experiencing migration in the same way. If the person migrating, the body which is migrating, is the body of a woman who's old, that body would experience migration in a different way than a body which is woman and young. So a person of a particular race would experience it differently from a person of another race. A person of a particular gender would experience it differently from other genders. There is some fantastic work that has been done on transsexual, migration of trans people from Africa. So we know that according to gender, race, class, age, and other categories, experience of migration may change. During the past 2 decades, in this century, in the last 2 decades, migration has increasingly developed into a subject of interdisciplinary approaches, with practitioners of each involved discipline making contributions to the field. Especially since the 1990s, new paradigms, actually not the 1990s, more so for the noughties of this century, new paradigms and approaches have gained momentum, tackling specific terminological inaccuracies and a wide range of misconceptions that have distorted scholarship in migration studies. First of all, scholars have begun to look beyond the normative model of global migration, one that focuses solely on European migration and the Western world, to focus on the rich and complex migration patterns and circulations of the entire modern and therefore pre-modern world. The reductionist push-pull modernization theory has also been considerably nuanced. A second source of distortion was the long-standing principle of methodological nationalism. There is no other way, a better way of describing this. A distortion in migration studies is because of the principle of methodological nationalism, which depicts migration as a linear process and relies on the nation-based idea of emigration, immigration, and notions of uprootedness. Recognition of the specious nature of this assumption has led to an epistemic move towards a more comprehensive systemic approach and the study of transnational communities. So if nation becomes a degree zero from which all your considerations of migration start, then the methodological nationalism starts to influence your understanding of migration in a way that cannot think beyond the nationalist frame, which cannot think beyond the nation box. Often enough, migrational flows are plurinational. Often enough, migration flows can circulate within one nation. Often enough, huge diasporic communities can form, which while being detached from each other, may share a very powerful cultural identity. So such transnational communities and more systemic approaches have been developed in the last 2 decades, surely. So basically what we are doing here is saying here is that old problem of social science is hardly dead. And this is something that we have to encounter continuously in the humanities, that we often think that we have very securely buried the vampire of a concept, but it keeps springing back and showing us that human nature does not really change. So here we see that migration studies has suffered for a very long time from Eurocentrism, long after Eurocentrism had been debunked. So, or Atlantocentrism, if you want to call it, it's across, it's a sentiment shared across the pond. So you can call it, rather call it Eurocentrism, we can call it Atlantocentrism. So Eurocentrism or Atlantocentrism has traditionally dominated mainstream migration research in Europe and the Americas, with migrational movements in other regions studied largely as aspects of European expansion. Baki prithibite ja kichu migration hocche fallout schedule. They are consequences or outgrowths, excrescences of the European model of migration. Shobai Europe migrate korte chaiche, Europe jara migrate korte chaiche na. They are basically, aberrations or outgrowths of the one unified Eurocentric model of migration. One reason for this limited perspective may be the segmented nature of the field of migration. Now, you may ask, Eurocentrism was fairly debunked in the 1960s, at least by the 1970s. There was a huge pushback, a huge reaction against Eurocentric studies. So why did it continue to the 21st century in case of migration studies? Because migration studies is a unique problem. This is what we have to understand. Migration studies, this phrase is a very Atlantocentric phrase by itself. Migration, and migration is a problem, is studied by Atlantocentric scholars, let's say. Whereas, other than that, people who work on migration in other parts of the world misrecognize migration studies as something else. It is not something bad. They are not doing something wrong. They do fantastic work. But what happens is that because of the different labeling strategies, migration study people do not recognize books written by, let's say, a scholar in Africa or Asia to be books related to migration. For instance, scholars on Africa, Asia, and Oceania often do not explicitly position their work within the paradigm of migration studies. Rather, they see themselves as contributing to specific scholarly debates on topics such as slavery, world systems, and imperialism. All these fields of study, whether you're studying slavery, whether you're studying world systems, whether you're studying imperialisms, in all these studies, you are studying migration in a very big way, but you're not labeling them as migration studies. So migration studies people cannot come together because they don't recognize each other's work as similar. This is a problem. Why? This is the problem why Eurocentrism could hold its own for a longer period in the study of migration. So, accordingly, this scholarship often goes unnoticed by migration historians. But now the scene is changing. Critiques of this imbalance often come from outsiders to the field. For example, from Patrick Manning, the famous Patrick Manning, a scholar of world history and African migrations, or from my personal favorite Adam McKeon, a specialist in Chinese migrations. So here, if you read the work of Adam McKeon, you'll see that how he attacks Eurocentrism or Atlantocentrism in, I'll give his example. At least one example I think should be given for us to better understand what is going on here. So he is a specialist, McKeon is a specialist on Chinese migrations. In his very famous article, Global Migration 1846 to 1940. So you can see he is taking almost a century span, and the article is simply titled Global Migration 1846-1940. It's a paradigm changing article in the migration studies field. McKeon fundamentally questions the accepted belief that the mass migration in the Atlantic world during that period, 1846 to 1940, was unique in nature and volume. So he challenges squarely the very thesis that the Atlantocentric academia had been proposing, that from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, it was the main channels of migration were focused on the Atlantic Ocean. He challenges it squarely. Rather, by adopting a wide-ranging view, McKeon redirects the reader's attention to two other major migration systems in Northern and Southeast Asia between the mid-19th century and the outbreak of the World War II. Furthermore, he argues that the Asian migrants moved for the same reasons and under similar circumstances, reacting to economic stimuli and moving to areas with a high demand of labor. He also shows that all three migration systems were integrated in the same global economy. So you can see that he points out that there were three overlapping migration systems which were all integrated into the same global economy, the same global division of labor exercised these migration systems, and he therefore dislocates the Eurocentric bias that was there for so long in historiography. Patrick Manning is a historian, and Adam McKeon is a historian, like Patrick Manning. Patrick Manning's work also does the same thing. So McKeon belongs to a cohort of scholars who reject Eurocentrism and Atlantocentrism clearly. Provincializing Europe and the Atlantic not only allows one to include other regions, but also challenges widely shared assumptions. For example, regarding free and unfree labor, dividing the West and the rest, static and mobile societies, and the impact of race on mobility. This requires comparisons and links, not only at the macro level, but also moving to those micro and meso levels of migrant agency, often largely ignored in global history. Compared to many other methodological theoretical frameworks, such as network theory, the neoclassical economic approaches, or the world systems theory, as well as approaches focused on state action and state borders, compared to these methodological theoretical frameworks, the systemic approach allows for comprehensive analysis of the structures, institutions, and discursive frames of the societies of origin and of arrival. In particular, local or regional variants, including factors such as industrialization, gender roles, family economies, or demographic details. The systems approach also focuses on the complexity of migrants' agency, as well as looking at the trajectories between societies. As historians Dirk Hoeder and Christian Hartzig argue, its comprehensive theoretical methodological framework incorporates, and I'm quoting, causational and incidental factors and outcomes, as well as multiple rationalities. The questions guiding such an approach can be manifold. In what ways did family, communities, and cultural practices inform the decision-making process? What human or social capital and what traditions of both short distance and long distance migrations were available to the migrants before and after departing? As journeys became even more time compressed through rail, sea, and air travel, how did this shape the migrants? Mental geographical maps. How do host societies' notions of assimilation, acculturation, and integration shape the newcomers' opportunities? How do migrants react to economic or social discrimination? How do diasporic cultures and mentalities, non-contiguous cultural groups, linked through real or imagined bonds across regional or global spaces, historically form and imagine themselves? How did they connect and develop cultural identities? Now, these are the kind of questions that any researcher in the field would come across. While I was working with the stateless people in Nepal's Jhapa district, the Lot Shampas, and also their relatives who had been given third country repatriation in USA. All these questions, or in the case of the stateless people in Kuch Bihar, when I was working with the Rohingyas, working on the Rohingyas, in all these cases, I've found that all these questions become very important. They animate the discourse which surround the process of migration involved in these contexts. These questions are only one small sampling of questions addressed by the systemic approach. One of this approach's strengths is its focus on continuing transcultural linkages and the interconnectedness of particular societies and states through transborder migration, capital flow, and ideas. Whereas any attempt at an all-encompassing theory may be futile. For example, micro and the macro may not easily be united in a single approach. So you can look at the large processes of global migration, but then it is almost a certainty that you will miss out on the textures and tangles, the details of everyday experience of migration at the ground level. If you get too involved in the details of everyday details of how migration takes place on the ground, then it may not be possible for you to get the bird's eye view of the global network of migration. So it is not very easy to bring together the macro and the micro into a single analytical field for a researcher. This is a researcher's problem. So if you delve too deep into the context of your study or into the subject of your study, let's say if you delve too deep into the problems of the Rohingyas, then it may not be possible for you to connect up this predicament of the Rohingyas with the other global migrational flows that are operating at the moment. But though a researcher has to admit this problem, this difficulty, but the strength of the systemic approach is that neither does it deny the importance of structural constraints on individual choices, nor does it downplay the agency of individuals and families. Further, lest one is apprehensive that invocation of a system concomitantly produces the vision of a methodologically inescapable, self-contained and self-regulating structure, systematicity in this context, systematicity is holographic, with many systematicities in many contexts, such as social context, economic context, political context, ecological, and so on. And more importantly, systematicity in this context mimics the Bakhtinian concept of systematicalness to denote unmerged parts and unfinalized non-wholeness, which includes as well the anti-systemic. Easier said than done. একটা ব্যাপার হলো গিয়ে থিওরি করতে হলে লোকেরা পটাশ করে দিতে পারে। If you ask a person to theorize about something, if you ask the person at the tea shop to give you an opinion about the current political situation of the world, India, in America, in Libya, the person will immediately give you an opinion. That is easy. A theory-ta সহজ। Demonstrate করা theory-টাকে is the difficult part. So far what I have done, what we have been doing is construct this, theory, the Spanish castle of a theory. Now we'll have to demonstrate it. Now, we cannot demonstrate it with many cases because I don't know already. I think I have taken a lot of time. I started around 4. It is already 47 minutes, therefore, that I have been a little after 4. So at around 40 minutes, I've already spoken. I'm going to speak for another 20 minutes. And within that time, what I'll try to do is provide you with at least 2 demonstrations of what we have been talking about. It is easier to propose a concept metaphor, or what people these days call a concept method metaphor. So it is easier to propose a concept metaphor or a concept method metaphor than to put it to work. Let us try to do the latter in the context of migration in contemporary history. Both refugees and so-called illegal migrants have traditionally been deeply embedded in the global rhetoric of crisis. Whenever we talk of a global rhetoric of human crisis, we often see the figure of the refugee or the illegal migrant coming up. Both have played important roles throughout the 20th century and will remain relevant for the foreseeable future. Let us try to engage these themes through, inevitably, selectively, due to the constraint of time, through within this conceptual methodological framework of systematicity that we have created. Let us first address the question of the refugees and refugee-ness. There is nothing new about the phenomenon of people being forced to leave their homelands. However, the legal concept of refugee and its employment as an object of academic research is more recent and constitutes an important aspect of contemporary migration. All of you know that the 1951 United Nations Geneva Convention defined a refugee as any individual who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, had crossed an international boundary to seek protection. Since the adoption of that definition, India has never signed the convention. So India does not recognize refugees, if you want to know, but most of the civilized parts of the world have signed it. But since the adoption of that definition, the distribution of refugees has attained a global scope. The 20th century nation-state system was highly effective at generating refugees. Anybody who is from India would know that this 20th century nation-state system is very efficient at producing refugees. With Europe taking the lead in the first half of the century, post-colonial Africa and Asia in the second half. Whereas the Refugee Convention was originally defined for those who had fled Nazi persecution in Germany and occupied Europe, from the 1960s on, as a result of decolonization and wars, new refugee populations arose mainly in the developing nations of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Central America. As Khalid Kosher reminds us, what had begun as a largely European problem at the end of the Second World War had become a truly global phenomenon with immense complexities. The 1990s saw the return of refugee crisis to developed countries, with groups originating in such regions as Bosnia, Kosovo, the former Soviet Union, and then eventually Syria, etc., shared the plight of those in Rwanda, Iraq, Afghanistan, and East Timor. But despite the myth of asylum invasion, the Europeans often tell you, if you go to Europe, if you sit around in bars, in restaurants, in coffee shops, they would often tell you, but it's slightly, hardline nationalist kind of people would often tell you that there is something called the asylum invasion, that we are being invaded by asylum seekers from other parts of the world, and to them we are losing our jobs, etc. But that is a patent lie. Statistics does not bear it out, and we see that despite the myth of asylum invasion in Western Europe, the majority of refugees are currently found in the southern hemisphere, particularly Africa and Asia. The bulk of the burden of supporting them, therefore, still falls upon the poorest parts of the world. The bulk of the refugees have to be handled by the poorest economies of the world. No matter how much Europe may shout that they are undergoing an asylum invasion. Despite the virtually uncontested definition of refugee status in the aftermath of the World War II, more recent discord as to the precise criteria for that status has sparked considerable scholarly debate. To begin with, neither the Geneva Convention of 1951 nor its 1967 protocol specifically addresses the current realities of refugees. The anthropologist Lisa Malky has argued that the term refugee does not constitute a naturally self-delineating domain of knowledge. Forced population movements have extremely diverse historical and political causes and involve people who, while all displaced, find themselves in qualitatively different predicaments. Whereas the convention focuses on state persecution, today's refugees more often flee the general insecurity of conflict rather than a specific persecution. And while economic inequalities generate far more refugees than political ideological conflict, economic migrants do not fit the convention's criteria of refugee status. Furthermore, the convention does not explicitly accept such conditions as sexuality-based persecution or ecological deterioration as flight-inducing factors. It still does not. Persecution on grounds of gender was included only as late as the 1990s. The person can be persecuted and therefore may flee from her country to become a refugee. Because she is a woman, this was not recognized till the 1990s. It is only in the 1990s that you could legally become a refugee. You could legally demand refugee status in another country, for gender-based persecution. Before that, you could not. So it is still, even today, sexuality-based persecution. Gender-based persecution and sexuality-based persecution, as you know, are two different things, are still not. Ecological degradation is not a cause for which you can demand refugee status. These are still to be done. Persecution on grounds of gender, as I told you, was included only in the 1990s. Finally, the convention is based on the political theory of sovereign states and does not cover persons displaced internally, for example, through civil wars. So IDPs, the internally displaced persons, the persons, let's say, who during the pandemic get dislodged from their job spaces and have to travel on foot long distances to reach their villages, will not be given any kind of legal protection. Refugees have a very strong kind of legal status and protection, but these people in India, in any case, they would not get, because India has not signed the Refugee Convention. So India can always claim that they would recognize no one as refugees, which it often does. But I'm talking of even in countries where they have signed the convention, where they want to work with the global community for the protection of refugees, for the care of refugees. Not always thinking that countries which do not respect refugee laws or the status of refugees often have the argument that ওরা বদমাইশি করে রিফিউজি হয়েছে, undeserving poor এর যে argument আছে in America. People are poor because they deserve to be poor. So don't give them any benefits, don't do any welfare towards the poor, because the poor are poor because they deserve to be poor. But they are lazy, they are laid back, they are unenterprising. That is why they are poor. So there is a similar kind of inhuman argument against refugees also, in particularly in countries which do not respect the refugee laws, that people are suffering because they are the source of their own suffering. Schwartz's ভাষায় যেটাকে আমেরিকায় বিখ্যাত বই তার undeserving poor. So finally, the convention is based on the political theory of sovereign states and does not cover persons displaced internally, as I was telling you, for example, through civil wars. Still, IDPs, or internally displaced persons, another category that I work with, currently outnumber those qualifying for UN protection. Unprotected by international agreements, these IDPs are often even more vulnerable than cross-border refugees. So we border cross-border, you are not a refugee. To be internally displaced. But cross-border refugees. This is a situation you often see these days in the world, across the world and in your own country. If you read the newspapers, you have seen this. Furthermore, the lines between voluntary and involuntary flight are often vague. Motives for flight can be a mix of economic and political forces, as when an economic collapse follows a coup d'etat. In some cases, direct violence is involved, in others, not. Refugee studies have criticized refugee agencies for protecting those who depart reactively, whereas those who behave proactively under deteriorating circumstances remain unprotected. With this principle in mind, the power of bureaucratic documentation to make social distinctions and classify human beings according to established criteria touches on an important aspect of modern migration policy. Since the 1980s, the national asylum procedures in Europe have become more complex, and the possibilities of international refugee protection as well as labor migration from the less developed countries have been seriously undermined by ever more restrictive laws and categorizations designed to disqualify claimants from international protection in most parts of the global north. And we know that all across the world this is happening. But at the same time, when they need labor, they can act flexibly. This we see in his widely cited articles on labeling refugees. Roger Zetter has been writing on, in 2007, his famous article, Labeling Refugees, came out. Roger Zetter reminds us that examining how labels are chosen and applied to those migrating can explain how certain bureaucratic, political, and other interests and procedures are crucial determinants in the definition of labels, such as refugee or forced migrants. Labels, he contends, are the, I'm quoting, the tangible representation of policies and programs, in which labels are not only formed, but are then also transformed by bureaucratic processes, which institutionalize and differentiate categories of eligibility and entitlements. Central to Zetter's thesis is the examination of the powerful institutional contexts involved and the discourses through which the category refugee is construed and public policy shaped. With respect to historical research, this entails examining not only the agency, settings, and motivations of refugees for leaving a country, but also the practices of states and other actors as they attempt to manage refugees through specific processes of labeling. Special attention must be focused on the sometimes deliberate fractioning and conflation of such labels in the interests of national and supranational actors or of the securitization of migration. In order to move beyond the conventional definition of refugees, we need to analyze the multiple actors, settings, and reasons influencing displacement in historical narratives. This may show that recent increases in the number of refugee groups have been accompanied by similar increases in the complexity of the causes, dynamics, and effects of global refugee flows, as can be witnessed in the recent proliferation of categories to describe the diverse global phenomena of forced development displacement. Refuginess involves much more than a single identity position, but includes the political refugee, the environmental refugee, the internally displaced person, and a host of other candidates. Faced with this plethora of human displacement categories, current conditions strongly suggest that the answer to the question, who is a refugee, must necessarily be plural, ambiguous, and most of all, historical. With respect to refugee migration, though, the historian Peter Gattrell has argued that questions should be asked not only about the circumstances of displacement or the practices of states and non-governmental agencies involved, but also, and I'm quoting Gattrell, about the complex relationship between those who observe and those who experience displacement. অর্থাৎ যে ডিসপ্লেসড হচ্ছে আর তার উপরে যে পড়াশোনা করতে গেছে গবেষক, তাদের মাঝের পাওয়ার রিলেশনটাও খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট টু গেজ। A historian must always be extremely conscious about the power relation that is woven into such relation. It anthropologists have been discussing for a very long time, as you know. Bronisław Malinowski, Motto থেকে আরম্ভ করে Claude Lévi-Strauss, in very different ways. They are very different anthropologists with very different ways. They've all been talking about the power implications between the researcher and the researched, and particularly in situations of victimhood. There is always a great danger that a victimology may be generated. The researcher may fall prey to a kind of subconscious victimology, and that may ignore the agency of the people who are migrating. So Peter Gattrell points that out to us. He points out that we must be conscious about the complex relationship between those who observe and those who experience displacement. Historians' perspectives both depend upon and determine their source material. In one writing with regard to the history of the state, or rather from a refugee-centered perspective, moreover, since refugee situations are very much the product of power imbalances, the refugee voice, refugee-দের কণ্ঠ, is unlikely to be even heard. তুমি হয়তো শুনতেই পাবো না, আমরা নিজেদেরই বেগানিতে মেতে থাকবো। So, given the power imbalances, the refugee voice is unlikely to be even heard, let alone recorded. In researching contemporary refugee-ness, oral history may provide, of course, a helpful tool in creating new sources and in gleaning new insights. In fact, if as a researcher, if you were to ask me from my personal experience, state or archival records in these cases can provide a very sketchy understanding, can generate a very sketchy understanding of the situation. It is these oral narratives, how you record them, how you try to, for a male researcher, often it is very difficult to access the voices of female researchers. So, collective research projects become very important here, where you share co-authorship. I have done that many times. I share co-authorship with a member of that community. That sometimes may there has to be women involved in your group, in that collective group of study. This author complex that Bengalis particularly have. The same person would direct the film, write the script, would be the DOP, would be the editor, would compose the music, write the songs, and therefore he's great. One does not know what that means in any case, but such pretenses have to be, such pretensions of greatness, and hello, mathar pechone thala has to be sacrificed if one has to go ahead and do constructive research in fields such as migration, where you are essentially an outsider. You are not merely an epistemological outsider in the sense that you think yourself to be united. You're an ontological outsider. You are actually an outsider, a bohiragato, to use that word. So you have to involve communities, you have to work together, you have to devise plans and strategies of research that would be collaborative research, cooperative research, not competitive research. So this such methods of research may also reveal refugees, the capacity of the refugees for agency against all odds. So then we can be surprised. That I will take 5 more minutes really, but before that I want to tell you a story. I was in this place, Coach Bihar, and I was studying the stateless populations of the Chit Mohol, or the enclaves that were there, that are still there. The BJP is claiming that they are not there, but they're still there to some extent. But yes, this present government, the Narendra Modi government, has solved the enclave problem to a greater extent than it was ever done before that. These problems are intractable and irresolvable. So one does not really blame. You can blame the government for many things, but these are things that you cannot really blame the government roundly for. So I was there, and I was, I was young then. This is like 12 years back. Or 11 years back. I was playing football at a field with the stateless people, and I continuously badgered them with questions like, "Tomade ki mone hoy? Tomade ki khali khali lage? Tomade kono rashtra nei? Tomra to rashtrabihin." So I amused you. They are school children. They loved me, and what happened is that once the ball went out of the field, and I was going outside the playground to retrieve the ball, and they were all screaming at me, "Don't go there, don't go there. You would become stateless because it is Bangladesh, and you may be nabbed by the Bangladesh police." So you can understand they can also get into a rhythm with you, and cooperate with you in very natural modes. So evoking very little response in scholarly studies of the past decade have been calls to historicize refugees, which I'm also trying to insist on, and the diversity of refugee experiences and strategies, as well as the vast array of discursive and institutional fields within which such labels as the refugee are being constructed. Such marginal attention to refugees in migration history may result from a sedentary bias in reaction to perceived challenges to nation-state approaches in history and the social sciences in general. But the studies of refugees and displacement may well offer fresh insights into the concepts of culture and community as bounded and territorialized units. There is perhaps a need, therefore, to dislocate the figure of the citizen that automatically spawns nation-statist histories and espouse the figure of the migrant as the organizing principle, the principle conjunct, the degree 0 of historical narratology. I'll stop here. Of course, this paper goes on. It discusses 3 other cases of illegality, and then it goes on to discuss the idea of hospitality and the possible impossible aporia, as Jacques Derrida understands, of hospitality. But we have spoken enough, and I think we have got enough material to quarrel about, and therefore I would stop here and perhaps have a discussion. I guess there have been some questions. Would Shudebda moderate, or should I go directly to the questions myself?
Thank you, Atig. If it is okay with you, can I,
Yes, of course. Yes.
So thank you, Dr. Ghosh.
Wonderful if you do.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for this rather wide-ranging approach to the problems of social movements, positive, negative, direct, indirect, in a way being forced upon, in a way socially, politically, cartographically. From students of literature, we need to add a little bit more. There's something called the concept of being thrust into movements where science fiction might come in. So thank you in a way, sort of introducing the problematize or the problems behind categorization, behind problems of marking, particularly the area that you sort of so vividly brought out, the concepts of movements within one's nation, within one's boundaries, particular reference to the Chhat Mahal, the Chit Mahal of the enclaves between Kuch Bihar and parts of Bangladesh, So if it is okay, we can begin with the questions. There are a few questions. The first question chronologically is from Shashwato Bhattacharya. Dada, how much is the migration of the Sufis in South India that has led to the growth of the important trading points in pre-modern India? And do you think that the migration of the major merchant bankers from the Mughal centers to the regional power centers in search of new opportunities in the 18th century led to the decline of the Mughal Empire, as pointed by Karen Leonard? So it's basically a question on the Sufis and the Mughal Empire.
Should I answer or should I take that? Okay, I can answer. Shashwata is a dear student of mine, very promising, and I get this opportunity, so let me praise him. So a very promising and bright student. Yes, Shashwata, as you know, sometimes the Sufis traveled on their own accord. Sometimes, like as you know, sometimes they fled from perceived political persecution. Sometimes there were too many tigers in the same forest, so their gurus told them to move. And of course, we know that the movement of the Sufis at least created three big cultures, three big Islamic cultures: the Gujarat, the Deccan, and Bengal, of course. So this is a very short answer to a question which can be amplified. The answer can be amplified with myriad examples of people like Jisudaraz, like Mujarrad, Shahjalal Mujarrad, and Ganji Shakar. So let us not go into names, just let us look at the structural processes. Of course, Karen Leonard's thesis is not a thesis that most people can agree with. So as you know that, what is his name? I forget the name of that Mughal, the Mughal state, the writer of the book Mughal State. So he has criticized Karen Leonard. Karen Leonard has done wonderful work on the Kayasthas of Hyderabad, but about the great firm theory that the bankers shifted, and that is why the Mughal Empire fell. So it has been criticized as a overturning of the famous phrase that rats abandon a sinking ship. This argument is like the rats jump off the ship, that is why the ship sinks. That is not the causality. The Mughal Empire started declining, that is why the bankers shifted. The bankers have been building the network following the Mughals for a very long time, that we know. If you look at Jahangirnagar, or if you look at Gujarat, if you look at South India, right up to Arcot, we see that wherever the Mughal army went, along with them, on their coat trails, the bankers and the moneylenders moved. These bankers and the moneylenders were mostly Khatris, whom we know as Marwaris, from the area of their origin, Marwar. And they came to Bengal. They had been there to some extent, but their networks became more entrenched in Bengal when they arrived in Bengal on the coattails of the Mughal army. The bankers and the moneylenders were not technically Bazarian or camp followers, but they were, of course, people who followed in the wake of the establishment of Mughal rule elsewhere. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. We move on to the next question from Ananda Dattagupta. Thank you for your scholarly talk. If I'm not mistaken, your concern predominantly is the politics of taxonomy and methodology. We know today that climate change is slated to become the single most important cause of global migration in this century. What does that imply for the methodology of migration studies? How will that challenge or reinforce the Eurocentric model of migration you have been critiquing in your talk? Also, would you say that climate change as a factor or cause of migration falls into the same secular or naturalistic pattern of human and animal locomotion across recorded time? So what little I can understand, there are three questions here.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Anandadi. Three questions, but they're related questions. And this is something I have spoken about. I have a paper on it also. This is of absolute importance. In climate change, environmental concerns, and climate change refugees. what we call climate change refugees. Now, climate change refugee, the very category of climate change refugees, is a paradoxical statement in the sense that climate change is not, environmental factors is not considered by the Geneva Convention to be, a factor which produces refugees. Now, this is a huge problem. The mindset will have to change, and these taxonomization, these fixed taxonomies of how we would perceive refugees, what factors produce refugees, this is what, as Onanati has correctly pointed out, I've been trying to argue. We must open up the semantic purport of terms such as refugees to a greater extent, pry them open so that they can accommodate all forms of displacement and not pick and choose between different forms of displacement. About the second part, of course, it is something that concerns deep history, and scholars such as Dipesh Chakraborty and others, and many others. Dipesh Chakraborty from our country, but there are many others who are engaged with this idea of deep history, which look at climate changes across geological time and how species, we are at the brink of what some people say the fifth extinction. So we don't know whether such doomsday predictions are, should frighten us to the extent that we do not start to kind of relinquish our hope of life in a matter of few years. But it is a very serious concern in the sense that we should consider such, even if they are sometimes somewhat overstated, we should take them seriously in the sense that if it inspires fear in the heart of people, I think that we, and particularly policymakers, because we often say that people are not conscious. People are mainly responsible for the degradation of the environment. That is true, but states, governments, policymakers, they not only refuse to change their policies vis-a-vis the environment, they also refuse to acknowledge that even in semantic shifts, even in broadening definitions. That is what I'm trying to say. And as academics, at least we should, and academics have been falling prey to this policymakers' conspiracy of fixing definitions into boxes and not letting them spread their semantic purport to wider fields. And I think that is very true. That is what I have been arguing. We need to look at all forms of displacement conjointly. And it is in the conjoint consideration of all forms of displacement that we can go beyond, such labeling, such limiting labeling strategies, and talk in terms of general dislocation, human rights, environmental degradation, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. The next question comes from Priyade. Millions of agricultural workers left the countryside and moved to the cities, causing unprecedented levels of urbanization. This phenomena began in Britain in the late 18th century and spread across the world and continues to this day in many areas. Also, industrialization encouraged migration wherever it appeared. The increasingly global economy globalized the labor market. Sir, if you could shed some light on it. So it's a long.
Yes, as I told you already, that there is a school which thinks that migration has taken on a unique form after the emergence of post-industrial societies, and particularly with the coming of decolonization. So this is the modernization theory, that modernization has produced in its turn its typical form of migration. While that could be true, that every age has its own particular brand, if we may say so, of migration. But there is no need to think. Oh my! Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but your
okay. I just had the false impression that you couldn't hear me. So the need here is the conceptual need here. The conceptual challenge here is to, look at all forms of migration across transhistorically, in a sense, so that a comparative understanding of why migration happens, what are the motors behind a migration, that is important. But otherwise, yes, this is a kind of migration that everybody recognizes. The IDPs, for IDPs as well, you know, industrialization is based on the idea of people leaving their villages and going to cities. It's a simplistic idea. It is much more complex than that, as all the Anglo-Dutch industrialization, which is the first industrialization, histories have shown, and also for Indian history, the original theorists like Lolita Chakraborty and others have been to a great extent corrected, and we see complex patterns of in which people move. There are circulatory patterns, there are one-way patterns. Indian laborers never severed their ties with the villages. So here we have a laboring class. I do not even know whether we can call them a laboring class, whether they were a class. They were so varied and fissured along lines of villages, region, language, society. So even if you want to construct the idea of migration as neoconservative thinkers think on the basis of the modernization thesis, in terms of urbanization driven by post-industrial development, even there we find in specific contexts, this is what I've been arguing throughout my talk, specific contexts produced very specific subject formations. So while it is important to take a global look at the processes of migration that is happening in the period of the so-called modernization, you also need to look at the specific local mechanics which give shape to migrational processes in specific contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. The next question, short, but I think it's loaded, comes from Somnath Nondi. Dada, please discuss the possible impossible aporia in the case of post-1947 West Bengal.
Somnath is being naughty. It is a very big subject, Somnath. I would say it is an entire section in this paper. If I were to talk about the possible impossible aporia of Derrida and the hospitality involved in it, it would take at least another half an hour. So yes, I will tell you, perhaps in another occasion when I have the opportunity to speak. Probably I will be speaking in the university's lecture series. So there I would take that up, or you come to my place and I'll teach you what it is.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. The next question from Dr. Neelmani Jaiswal.
Yes.
In current neoliberal economy where migration is considered to be contributing to development, how do you see need for equilibrium between influx of migrants into urban space and uninterrupted development of urban area?
Dr. Jaiswal, it is a very, very good question. Now, what happens is that neoliberal is the new right. New right is a combination of libertarian tendencies of economics and neoconservative tendencies of politics. And therefore, you know, what happens is that they maintain a revolving door policy. So while America is building walls along the Mexican border, it wants to build that wall across Mexican border. We see periodically when there is a labor crunch, some people are allowed to trickle in, so that, you know, the American economy does not fall face first to the ground. And therefore, all over the world, you know, neoliberalism or the new right governments, as they have weakened the economic role of the state, economic policy making role of the state, practicing a form of market fundamentalism, if not a form of anarcho-capitalism, which like Milton Friedman's son, what is his name? He's Jamon Baba Tamon Chile. That guy, anarcho-syndicalist, what is his name? Thomas Friedman or something like that. People like them, they do not want the state at all. They just want the market would itself, you know, not only solve economic problems, but also problems of the soul. So now what happens in such visions is that the state is not weakened. What happens is that the state is redeployed. The state is redeployed to act as a guardian of business interests. So the state is not needed when everything is going fine. But if there is a mica mine on which a huge tribal population stays in a reserved forest, then the state will be redeployed to come and take over that forest, cut down the trees, displace the tribal population, and allow the multinational company or whatever business interest is involved to mine that mica. So as you said, it is a heavily politically freighted question. So I had to give you a heavily politically freighted answer. It is, of course, as you can understand, there is this revolving door policy. Migrants are monsters when you don't need them, but you need them often because of your the best thing is if you can outsource everything, then that is the best thing. So if Reebok can manufacture its shoes in the sweatshops of Indonesia and Bangladesh, that is the best. When they cannot, when there's a political crisis, or when there's something that is not allowing them, then they would settle for controlled doses of migrant entry, which America is pioneering in the case of Mexican labor. Is what I'm trying to tell you. Otherwise, you can continue to villainize or demonize refugees while setting up all your factories in the same countries from which the refugees originate. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Short
Shudevda, this is Partho. Can I ask a question?
Yes, Partho, please go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Ghosh, you talked about the several factors that contribute to human migration. Now, I don't know whether I will be able to articulate my question properly. As a historian, please make sense out of my question.
Please.
So we get the news from all over the world that several nations of the world like China, Japan, and even in Europe, they are passing through several crises, like say low fertility rate, aged population, and with the kind of very much linked to low fertility rate is the possibility of a population decline all over the world. I'm just curious to know whether how much these factors like low fertility, aged population, possible population decline, all these factors going to affect the nature and the pace of human migration all over the world. Thank you.
Any society or any population or any demographic that is facing low fertility rates would, of course, be confronted in the long term by a gerontological bias, as in an elderly population. And this does happen if we look at the demographers or the demographic studies people, then we see that there is a rhythm to fertility rates across the world, but these are very big data, and such big data are sometimes, we often, it is a jungle, it's such a big jungle that we often lose out on the specificities of certain cultures in terms of the population growth or decline. So population growth, decline, these are factors that have to be studied both in terms of the big data and also in terms of specific cultural contexts. So while there is a general trend of population decline in the world, India is facing a youth bulge, as you know. India is not the only outlier. Many countries in Africa, they are facing what is now to these days called a youth bulge. Now, whether demographic decline or demographic growth would ultimately influence the vectors of migration is very difficult to predict. There has been no pattern in human history which has shown that the population which is declining in number is not migrating. So there is, of course, the Malthusian thesis that pressure on the resources causes a decline in population either through death or through migration. But there have been, historians have been able to demonstrate for many cultures across many periods of history that when a population is declining, it does not mean people will not migrate. Or when a population is booming, it would mean that there would be a greater pressure on resources and jobs probably, and people will migrate. Such easy equations are not historically demonstrable.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you, Partho. A short question from Aisha. I think I've got the name right. Dada, what is the common cause of migration in human history?
Oh my God, Aisha, it is a huge question. There can be any number of causes. It can be political, social, it can be epidemic, it can be environmental, as Anandadi correctly pointed out. It is becoming more and more, ecological factors are becoming more and more responsible for movement of populations. It can be, and many of them are not recognized as causes for migration legally. But they are all causes of migration. Conflict, political conflict, of course, ideological, political conflict, because you and I, we don't share the same political opinion and you are in power. So it is a plethora of reasons that can produce migration. Rather than focusing on what produces migration, we should look at the fact of displacement. That is more important. That is the more ethical approach to take.
Thank you, Atig. So a question from Ushoshi Nondi: how do children view migration and what kind of impact does it have on the subject self?
Ushoshi is, of course, a person trained in this field as well. And therefore, Ushoshi's question is a very, very specific and good question. The question of children and migration, at least from my field, has been particularly difficult to track because of the fact that they are often their guided opinion. If you ask them, if you hold them to a question for some time through, through the offer of chocolate or something, or because you are young and they find some you to be a curious bird among them, what happens is that they often regurgitate what their parents have discussed in their own, filtered through their own understanding. But in their daily, for instance, in the Jhapa camps, at Damak of Jhapa district, where I encountered the Lord Shampas, children found to have, I found they had adapted to the fact of their dislocation much better than the adults who had stronger memories. And this, however controversial it may seem, is unfortunately a fact that I also encountered among the Rohingya population. Therefore, there is a bimodal problem to this question, as I see. One is that how far are we being able to recover from, there is a field of studies, Ushoshi, as you know, there is a field of studies that is developing, which is called the resilience studies. So in face of great dislocation, in face of great challenges and disruption, how do people survive? The question of resilience. Because this resilience has become entirely new. It is within the field of migration studies. It's a new field of studies that is developing. And in such studies, we find the question of children are coming up more centrally because children can adapt better to newer realities. Is it because their experience is not as deeply entrenched in terms of cultural, social, political, familial and familiar loss than adults? Is a question I'm not sure about. I don't know the answer to, because I would lean towards yes, but that might become a controversial answer. So I would refrain from giving a clear-cut answer to that. But yes, my experience from the field for the Rohingyas as well as the Lot Shampas, and not to speak of the stateless people of the Chinese stateless people in Calcutta groups that I have studied. All of these are the Sri Lankan Tamil Sri Lankans in Tamil Nadu. All these groups that I've studied, I've been able to meet, interact with. I've seen that in camps, in stateless camps. I remember having visited the Geneva camp in Dhaka, close to Dhaka, where the Bihari Muslims who had gone to Bangladesh during partition were now located because they had sided with the Pakistani army. So Bangladesh has not given them. Even there, we saw that the possibility of integration, the possibility of intermingling, the possibility of adaptation to the mainstream society was greater among children. And they were being adopted. They were melting into the population often enough. It was the adults who freighted with their memory, freighted with their experience of dispossession and dislocation and loss, and probably a degree of disenfranchisement also, coped worse.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. So there's one more question from Shashwato. Dada, do you think that the present COVID-19 pandemic situation and lockdowns have led to the reverse migration from urban areas to rural areas to some extent at least? And the next question which follows, what is the role of brokers in migration of laborers in India?
No, there has been, this is reverse migration is, these people are migrating internally. So, and soon after reaching their villages, many of them have already started returning to their workplaces, even to return to inhuman statuses, because, you know, this idea for reverse migration from the city to the village has a romantic tinge to it, which does not stand up to historical reinterrogation. They were not welcome, mostly in their villages. So there is no point in romanticizing, as the newspapers did, their march homewards. These people are people in limbo. These people live in a dislocation. Dislocation has become their ontological reality. They cannot escape it. So the idea of this very idea of reverse migration has a kind of purport that in the cities, they were kind of, you know, dislocated people, anomic dislocated population. If they go back to their villages, which are their roots, then they would be returned to their original state of tranquility, their paradisiacal, their Edenic, almost their Edenic existence. That is not true. These people are defined by their disposition. Their subjectivization, in the dual sense of the term of being subject to and being the subject of. Their subjectivization is imprinted, marked, overmastered by the fact of their dispossessed status. And of course, how do Shashwata's next question was? Of course, as you know, labor recruitment in migrations which involve labor migration in Khetre, the Arkatis or the Shordars or the jobbers, that is the intermediaries, the dalals, become important. But in case of other migrations, the nature of the laws can be very different. For instance, in case which I did not discuss today,
Atig, you have been on mute once again. Atig, could you please unmute yourself? Atig, you have inadvertently put yourself on mute. Atig, if you can hear me, please unmute yourself. Yes, you're back on now. Yes, Atig.
Yes. Is that all?
Atig, just repeat what you just said, please.
Yeah,
about the brokers. I was saying about the brokers. Till what extent did you hear?
Last 50 seconds, 45, 50.
Oh, I was saying that about the brokers question. I was saying that, labor migration in case of labor migration, brokers are important. We know about the roles of the jobbers, architects, that's the various forms of recruiters. For military migration in many societies, we think that military migration has stopped, but it has not. There are many rebel groups which recruit military men, which recruit people with arms training, ammunition training. In all these cases, the nature of these brokers operate in a certain way, but there are other cases, like in the case of human trafficking. That is what I was telling you. The nature of the brokers can be very different. Human trafficking in Siliguri, I have studied at least the North Bengal border on human trafficking, which is one of the most porous borders through which human trafficking takes place. It has two borders. Human beings are trafficked from Nepal into India, and then from India to into West Bengal, and from West Bengal to other parts of India. From Bangladesh to West Bengal, North Bengal, and from North Bengal to other parts of India. Here you see that men, when they are trafficked, often enough it is assumed that the man had some consent in his own trafficking. And therefore, the broker is not thought to be such a villainous person as in case of a woman being trafficked. In case of female trafficking, often it is assumed that the woman is being trafficked against her will. Of course, women are, as you know, in popular understanding, weak people who have no opinion of themselves. In my interviews, I have around 20-25 interviews of trafficked women, of which 80% of them have said that they fully knew that they were being trafficked and they consented to the traffic. However, because of our perception of certain gender roles, how the patriarchal society, the heteronormative patriarchal society, the male stream society, how it would perceive gender trafficking, also therefore colors the image of the trafficker. In case of the male trafficker, as in trafficker who traffics men, it is a much more agreeable character, whereas traffickers who traffic women are not. So it is a complex question, and it is related to the base, the social base to which such brokers are tied.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Maybe one last question from Shangomitra Shingo. Which is the second largest migration in human history?
Which is the first largest? Shangomitra.
দাদা ওই আফ্রিকার যেটা
out of Africa, but that happened in phases. Of course, that did not happen all at once. We think one of the estimates is that forced migration, the Indian partition is often considered. So though these figures are controversial, but Indian partition is often considered to be one of the second largest flow of people, forced migration. Otherwise, there has been the Golden Horde, the Mongolians have traveled, so many others, but those were military movements, not forced migrations.
Thank you, Atig. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you to all of you.
Yes, thank you, especially because you're battling COVID as well as being part of this, one full year of our dialogic Visva-Bharati Young Scholars.
My privilege.
Our privilege for listening to you. Thank you once again. So would Bipashadi come in, or should I ask Partho to sort of conclude with the words of thanks? Bipashadi, would you like to come in and say a few concluding
I'll just
words?
say that, Atig, this was a great lecture and thank you. It has been tremendous for you in spite of your illness that you have been able to deliver. It's more than 2 hours now. I'll just keep it short. I'll just ask Partho Shudev for the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Bipashadi. Thank you, Atig. May I now request Partho Pratim Roy, our colleague from Patho Bhavan, to come and deliver the final words of thanks. Partho.
Thank you, Shudev. Namaskar and good evening to everyone. Well, dialogic Visva-Bharati Young Scholars lecture series, right? As dialogic completes its one-year journey, it's time to look back a bit and thank those who have been with us to make it happen. Let me begin by offering our heartfelt gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Vidyut Chakraborty, for his constant support and encouragement. Dialogic is his brainchild. Without his presence, without his cooperation, it would not have been possible. So thank you very much, sir. We thank the Registrar Visva-Bharati for his active involvement and constant support. We thank Visva-Bharati administration in general for all kinds of cooperations. A special thanks to Dr. Nimai Shah, librarian in charge, for his assuring presence. Now, the mentor of our lecture committee, Professor Bipasha Shah. Professor Bipasha Raha. Bipashadi is all grace and insight. Her calming presence brings balance and inclusion in the group. So thank you, Bipashadi, for guiding us. We thank Dr. Atig Ghosh and Sri Ajay Sharma for smoothly running the publicity affairs like creation of the links for the lectures, their circulations, etc. We are extremely fortunate to have Sri Arpan Mukherjee of Kala Bhavan in our gets wonderful and thought-provoking flyers for all our lectures. For this particular talk today, Sri Bihan Das, MFA student of Kala Bhavan, in collaboration with Sri Prashant Firangi, Assistant Professor of Graphics Art, Kala Bhavan, we thank them for designing the flyer of today's talk. Now, Dr. Shudev Pratim Basu gives us his inputs proactively, and generally he's very popular in our group, and generally he moderates the session. So we thank Shudevda. We thank all our other committee members, Dr. Shubhasri Sanyal, Dr. Saran Ishika Maiti, Dr. Mohua Banerjee, Dr. Chitralekha Maiti, Srimati Orpita Datta Das, Dr. Shomadip Chattopadhyay, and Muhammad Mazharul Hamid for their precious suggestions and constant support. It's the inclusive idea of Honorable Vice Chancellor that we were able to incorporate 11 speakers, including today's speaker, from the various departments of Visva-Bharati. If things come to normalcy, we would be able to organize maybe in a hybrid mode, that is online, offline, both. So we hope to enjoy your company then. Till then, goodbye. And thank you very much for everything. Namaskar.
Ajoy, Kaushik, if you could sort of stop the recording.